How'd you like to listen to .NET Rocks with no ads? Easy. Become a patron. For just $5 a month, you get access to a private RSS feed where all the shows have no ads. $20 a month will get you that and a special .NET Rocks patron mug. Sign up now at patreon.netrocks.com. Hey, guess what? It's .NET Rocks. This is Carl Franklin.
And this is Richard Campbell.
Back with you for another awesome show. And this is going to be an amazing show.
I know it will be. I'm sure.
Well, we're going to have some fun, but this is momentous news.
Momentous.
Joel Hulen and Martin Costello are here. We're going to talk to them about Poly. But first, we have some things to do, right? Like Better Know Framework.
All right, hit me.
Let's roll it.
All right, dude, what do you got?
So I know last week I talked about the AI bot show.
Yeah.
Yes, but since last week, Brian McKay and I have started a podcast version of it.
Oh.
So if you go to the AIBotShow.com now, episode 12, you will see has a little podcast label on it, and it's audio only. And when you click it, you'll go to another page that has the player and all the links. We basically decided to turn it into a news-oriented AI podcast.
Right.
And as such, because things are changing so fast, and, you know, our videos get a limited lifespan because, by the time it goes out, the responses you might get from ChatGPT will be completely different.
Right.
And you may want to do things completely differently because there are new features and new things. So we just decided to go all news.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Try and keep up. Good luck. It's a fast-moving problem.
Yeah. The news is good. And you could see by the number of links there on episode 12 that we had plenty to talk about. So that's it.
Yeah.
Go to the AI Bot Show. Oh, and by the way, by now it should be in Apple Podcasts and Google. It's already on Stitcher and in Spotify. So you'll be able to find it wherever you get your podcasts. It's the AI Bot Show podcast.
Cool.
That's it. Who's talking to us, Richard?
Grabbed a comment off of show 1556, which is a long flipping time ago. Right? That's the one we did with Dylan Reisenberger talking about Poly in 2018.
Wow.
Time does fly.
Yeah.
And this comment comes from Mike, who says, I thought Dylan's shout out for Up for Grabs was pertinent, so I thought I'd share the link in case anyone comes looking for it. And it's up-for-grabs.net. And which I think most people know about. And so I went and checked it. I went to Up for Grabs and looked for Poly, and sure enough, it's there. Mm-hmm. And there are still several Up for Grabs items there, including one Martin put in like a week ago. So, just making it very clear that even though years ago we talked about Up for Grabs and getting more people involved in open source projects, this is still an ongoing thing, and Poly is certainly part of it.
Yep.
And Mike finishes up with his comment saying, and thanks to AppVNext and Microsoft and everyone else involved with Poly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a good thing.
It's a good thing. And here you go, Mike. We're going to talk about version 8 because somehow you guys got to version 8. I'm concerned. That's a large version number. That's,
a momentous update.
Yeah. So, Mike, thank you so much for your comment. And a copy of Music to Code By is on its way to you. And if you'd like a copy of Music to Code By, write a comment on the website at .netrocks.com or on the Facebooks. We publish every show there. And if you comment there and I read it on the show, we'll send you a copy of Music to Code By.
And you can follow us on X if you want.
Yeah.
But I just can't get used to saying X.
I don't want, the social media formerly known as Twitter.
Yeah, exactly. But the cool kids are hanging out on Mastodon. It's extremely much less polluted than X.
Yeah.
And I'm at Carl Franklin at techhub.social.
And I'm Rich Campbell at mastodon.social.
Send us a toot. That's another way you can win a copy of Music to Code By.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so let's introduce Joel and Martin. Joel Hulen, of course, has been on the show before. He's one guy that I discovered through AppVNext, and now has more than 26 years, probably 27 or 28 years of experience in the IT field, gaining expertise in a variety of disciplines ranging from systems engineering to cloud-based computing and everything in between. Joel's an international speaker focusing on such topics as cloud architecture, serverless, data engineering, and AI. He also creates and delivers training on these topics to Microsoft employees and partners, and is also a major contributor to Poly. Martin Costello, one of the Poly Martins, we'll talk about that in a minute because there are at least two, is a .NET developer and tester, as well as a Microsoft MVP in developer technologies based near London in the UK. He currently works for JustEatTakeaway.com as a principal software engineer. He's a big fan of open source software and as well a maintainer of Poly. He's a community triager for the ASP.NET Core project in GitHub. And I just got to tell you that Grammarly does not recognize the word triager or serverless for that matter.
It's not actually a word, triager, but I mean, somebody's got to do the triage. That's true.
He's a triager. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Guys.
Welcome, Joel. Welcome, Martin.
I've got to say, I'd rather be a triager than a triagee.
Absolutely.
Especially not in the medical field as well.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right. The worst thing you can hear as a triagee is, this one can wait.
Yeah.
Or we'll just cut it off.
Get me a saw.
Or I've never seen this before.
Martin, there are other Martins in the Poly project, right? How many are there?
So there's another two, which creates lots of confusion when there's a very populated call. Because the Martin you mentioned earlier tagging the issue wasn't me.
Right.
Nice.
Yep.
Wrong Martin right there.
Kind of figured that. So there are no greater or lesser Martins. They are all on equal footing. And Martin Costello is the Martin that we have here today. So, Joel, I guess, well, you or Martin, who wants to give us the basic elevator pitch as to first of all, what Poly is and why version 8 is so momentous?
I'll let Joel have the honor.
All right, fine. I'll take that one. Yeah, sure. So, Poly, I know that you referenced the show that Dylan was on back in 2018. I mean, that feels like forever ago because it kind of was.
Yeah, it's a whole pandemic ago.
It was a whole pandemic ago. And we were already making some major improvements to Poly at that point. So if we back all the way up, Poly was originally developed by a fellow named Michael Wolfenden. And I think it started probably around 2013. And by and large, it is a library that is meant to help you in a very fluent way to be able to address transient issues, transient type of errors. Think of things like I've got to make a REST-based call to this service, and that service could be down. How do I gracefully handle that? How do I retry it or do some other strategies? And so essentially anywhere you can run .NET, you can run Poly. And so Poly is, like I said, it's a library. So it does have a lot of dependencies, a lot of projects out there. And so back in 2015, Michael Wolfenden, for whatever reason, he wanted to find somebody to take over the project. He just didn't have time for it anymore. Nobody responded. Finally, I said, okay, I'll see what I could do to help. And so at that time, I think I'd been with App VNext for about a year. And I talked to Carl and I said, hey, what do you think about us bringing this, instead of under me, bring it under App VNext? So it's under an organization. And you thought that was a great idea. I'm putting words in your mouth maybe, but I believe that's what you said.
No, that's absolutely what happened.
Yeah.
I was using Poly and I loved it. And you could see the downloads of Poly just exponentially growing year after year after year.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And so we made a concerted effort to look at what are the features that the community is asking for. How do we make this better? And Dylan, who was on that call, he was one of our primary architects on that project. And he really kept moving things forward, right? And so we jumped a bunch of versions. And so fast forward to December of last year, we are on Poly V7. I think we had like 300 something million downloads at that point.
And by the way, it is part of the .NET framework.
It is.
in the HTTP Client Factory.
Yes, and the HTTP Client Factory came about a few years ago. That was a collaborative effort with Microsoft. But Emo Landworth from the .NET team reached out to me on X, previously Twitter, December of last year.
Twixter.
And so what he was saying is that Poly is a library that's used by a lot of the engineering teams. It's used by the .NET team. It's used by the Azure teams for a lot of services. It's used by teams.
The teams
and
team.
they were the teams team. And so what they wanted to do was to figure out, okay, we want to make some potential breaking changes along with your help, as the Poly maintainers, and really focus on making improvements to performance.
Right.
Because what they were seeing is the performance has been okay. It's a library that shouldn't add too much latency to your applications, but until you hit a certain scale. And what they're finding is with some of the cloud scale type of stuff that they were doing, the way that Poly was structured at the time, with a lot of overloads, a lot of excess allocations and things,
tasks,
it did start having some performance implications at certain scale. I'd say 90-something% of people would never see this, but they were seeing it. Stuff happens in the cloud.
Stuff happens in the cloud that is not normal.
Yeah.
So that is true.
Who knows? Hundreds of thousands of requests, like it could be millions of requests, and suddenly every cycle matters.
Yep.
I seem to remember they said something to us. They've been doing some performance profiling work on like one of the either Azure or the Teams services, and they'd got to the point where we were the bottleneck. Like they'd hacked away everything they possibly could to just get that last processor instruction out and get more bang for their buck. And we were the biggest problem now.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow.
So that's always fun.
And they didn't just propose like performance tweaking. It required an architectural change at the lowest level, right?
Yeah. And some of these were things that I think we just had as open issues for forever because they weren't prioritized. And you also have to have time to get to these things.
Yeah. Well, and they probably weren't normal problems. Like there's like everybody's working fine. This would be a good idea, but it doesn't buy anybody anything until it finally did.
Right. You just need to look at them all like together. Because if you just have lots of individual issues where each one is breaking, you just go, oh, that isn't important enough to create a breaking change.
Right.
And you don't look at any of the others. But I think the Microsoft team looked at it at a bit of a higher level than us. And they were like, if we put all this stuff together, there's a release.
Right. And it's a re-architecting.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's some cruft in there that, technical debt, whatever you want to call it, that we were well aware of, like all the overloads. Hey, we need to add something. Let's just overload this existing method again.
Right.
More overloads.
More overloads. And it was starting to get out of hand. I mean, and we knew it, but again, think about priorities and the like.
Yeah.
So what we got with Emo and the .NET team really wanting to rally around this with a stated goal of, hey, we want to take down the number of allocations to 0 if we can.
Right.
That's probably the biggest performance impact. And they had certain goals in mind. A couple of weeks ago, what was announced is the Resilient App Development Library. So the Microsoft.extensions.resilience and then Microsoft.extensions.http.resilience. And so these are two NuGet packages that are built on top of Poly. And there's some internal stuff in the .NET framework that they wanted to use Poly for, rather than, hey, let's go off as Microsoft and create a resilience framework on our own that's not already adopted and well known by the community. They didn't want to go that route. So props to them for first reaching out to a very active community project and seeing, can we collaborate together, right? And so they had certain goals in mind where they needed to get this work done. So they were willing to allocate a couple of developers on this project. So Martin Tomka is one of the Martins. He was one of the guys who did most of the work, over the last several months. And he was dedicated to getting these features pushed forward. And so that was a huge boost for us, right? And so we had a lot of design meetings leading up to that. We had regular meetings scheduled with the team to go through the API changes, making decisions. So it was a really interesting and fun kind of collaboration.
Earlier on, you said there was going to be some breaking changes, but I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we overcame those and we're able to create a compatibility layer. Is that true?
That sort of happened and sort of didn't happen. So Poly itself depends on poly.core, which is the new assembly that contains all the new low allocation bits. And we didn't change any of the API surface from the original Poly library. So people can upgrade to it and it shouldn't break anything, but they don't get the new high performance mode in like big air quotes.
Okay.
There was some investigation to like create a compatibility layer. So we'd effectively gut the old Poly and route it through the new Poly. But because of the fundamental design problems that Microsoft tried to solve, there was no real way to bridge the two APIs without actually making the performance worse than it was already. I say worse, not as good.
Yeah, not as good. And the new architecture involved interfaces, right? Whereas we didn't really have those before. And that is a fundamental difference in the way you approach a programming problem. Is that part of the reason why the compatibility didn't?
There's some interfaces in the design, but a lot of it is also like concrete types, because the downside you get to let's interface everything is that as soon as you want to change anything, it's a breaking change because you need to extend the interface, especially because we have compatibility for .NET Framework. And not all versions of that support like extension interfaces. I've forgotten the proper name for them. Default interface methods. That's what I'm thinking of.
So, Joel, when you said they wanted to use stuff in the .NET Framework, you meant the .NET Framework, not .NET Core or .NET as it stands today, right?
Right. Yeah. So Poly has been backward compatible for the .NET Framework for a while, ever since Core came out. We intentionally tried to make sure that we brought forth, the capabilities to the .NET Framework as well. And so there, as you can imagine, there's some long-term implications. That's something Martin hinted at here in keeping that compatibility. So
if you wanted to just upgrade right now, without the super high power new stuff, are you going to see any performance increase or, for that matter, any performance degradation?
So I think anything you get without doing a code upgrade and just changing your package references is just going to be the delta of noise of whatever you're running on top of. So in essence, no, you will not get any significant change either way if you just bump the version numbers and do nothing else.
And that's okay, I think. Yeah, that's completely acceptable.
The docs, we do have, we're using GitHub.io, GitHub Pages, to generate a site called polydocs.org. And so you can get to those docs from the normal repo as well. But there is a migration document in there for, okay, you are wanting to use the new poly.core and take advantage of everything, including the performance improvements. Here are some code snippets and ways that you can migrate your old policies to the new strategies, which, by the way, is a change. Before, everything was just called a policy. Now they're called strategies.
But we're not going to change a product to Stratty, are we?
I mean, I'm not a marketing person, but I'm thinking that would not be very good.
You can change the logo to a Stratocaster? That's not so bad.
I don't know, man. I kind of like the parrot.
I just like the riff on the guitar when you do something right.
But you can have the parrot play the guitar.
Yeah. Get the parrot to play the guitar. Now Martin's on it. He's got to figure it out.
Okay. I think we can concede.
That's the Strat right there. I'm pointing to.
Okay. Oh man, that thing's only as big as your finger.
I know, right?
How do you play that?
Visual gags on a podcast.
There you go. Doing visual gags. Now, wait a second. So you had a Microsoft employee focus full time on Poly for months.
Yeah.
I don't know how full time, but
Yeah.
in our meetings, it sounded like it was fairly full time.
Mm-hmm.
His focus, at least for some period of that, and he was working on it a lot. So I'd say, yeah,
Sure. It's because you've got a regular job too. I mean, both of you do.
yeah.
So, I mean, how much pressure is put on you to make time for all of this?
I think in some ways I got more of the pressure than Joel because Martin Tomka's based in Czechia. So I'm a lot more in the right time zone for code reviews than Joel. But my company as well is like, we try to embrace open source as well because we use lots and lots of things. We use Poly, XUnit, you name it. So my line manager was very supportive in like giving me time on the sort of company time to contribute to the project. So it wasn't all just being done in my like spare time.
Right. So as this came down that Microsoft wanted to focus on it, that wanted to be an important part, you were able to share it with your leadership and they're like, well, this is a good thing for everybody. So do what you got to do. Yeah.
Because I think I don't have any concrete numbers, but I imagine Poly is right up there in terms of popularity within our internal GitHub Enterprise instance in terms of what we use in our own applications to power our services.
Yeah. No, and then this is a discussion we've had around open source for a while. It's like, what happens when an employee is assigned to your volunteer driven project? So it feels to me like this is a good news story, but it sounds like he was a very collaborative person too. Like it was easy to get in and chat through things and keep everybody on board.
100%. And that was one thing that when Emo first brought this to me as a potential thing, he was very sensitive about the fact that this is an open source community driven project. And he did not want this to feel like it's a takeover. He didn't want to feel like we're just kind of on the sidelines observing from the outside, but rather being a part of the whole process and making sure that we are still involved in decision making as far as where it's going, all the different design decisions and stuff. So,
because the alternative was that they write something themselves, right?
Right.
Like they could have done that and just said, hey,
they could have, yeah.
This is a special case for us because it's cloud scale and we're going to do something totally different as opposed to what they did do.
I'd like to talk some more about the whole open source thing after the break, but before the break, we got to get back to the outcome. Like, what were the performance gains? Do you have any metrics in terms of scalability and performance gains of Poly V8?
We do have, as part of the build process, benchmarks that run every time. So we get updated benchmarks. And that way we can make sure we're not degrading in any way as we make changes.
Okay.
So I've just randomly looked at one of the benchmark results that we've got checked into the repository at the moment from the last time they were run. And as an example for the timeout policy, in version 7, this benchmark was 437 nanoseconds and 728 bytes allocated. And then Poly V8's equivalent is 349 nanoseconds. So that's a 20% improvement and 0 allocations. So 100/infinite.
Yeah.
Congratulations. That's fantastic.
But that was the goal, was to get to 0 allocations.
That was.
Yeah.
I don't think we ever put it in stone as it must be 0 and forever be 0.
No, but it's like, can we get there is an interesting thing. Like, it seems bizarre to me that you got to 0 allocation. Like, how do you make that work?
Well, I can tell you one way. In wherever there's a task, there is now a value task, which is a value type rather than a reference type.
That's like most of the breaking changes to the API surface were changing to value task. And there's also various changes that are in support of you being able to like use static lambdas for like the code you want Poly to call for you. So you can still code it the way with the old Poly, but you don't get as much improvement. But then if you really want to shave things down, like there's slight readability degradation in some cases. But if you really want that performance, you can like sort of switch into like a slightly different mode, and then you lose all the allocations from the closures as well. And then you get even more memory allocations dropped on the floor. Not dropped on the floor. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Shaved.
Well, it speaks to me of this code as an open source project is an example of how to build really high performance cloud code. Then, like zero allocation code is kind of a big deal.
Yeah, and I guess as well, it's one of those doesn't always work for everyone. Is like,
right.
If you've got something that's used at the scale Poly is, like when you multiply up those savings to everyone who uses it, if everyone adopts the new stuff, that's quite a big chunk into like CO2 emissions and things like that. Whereas if you've got a project that you maintain yourself, it's got like a couple of thousand downloads, it's probably not worth the effort of putting all of this engineering into it to just like save a few CPU cycles every other month.
Yeah, I was going to mention the same thing, It's sort of like green code in a way, because if you look at the scale overall, saving energy and cycles and all that kind of stuff, it's worthwhile at certain levels of scale. But again, that's not everybody.
You got to get there for it to make sense. You don't want to build that way off the bat. But was that what they came to you with? I thought they came to you with performance and resource consumption, not so much specifically, hey, we're trying to cut the CO2 consumption.
Oh, no, not at all. Not at all. That's just a nice byproduct of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think part of the use case for all the savings, to not speak for Microsoft, but try and badly remember what they might have said at the time, was with all the pandemic growth in the cloud and things like Teams, like it was costing them a lot more to run the service because they needed more stuff, but they didn't want to pay the same percentage extra of how much stuff they had for how much traffic they had. So it was all about how can we run more on less.
Right. And so it's certainly been a theme over on the sysadmin world in Run As Radio about that, how to do more with less. And some of it has been conversations about moving up the stack, like getting off the VMs and into platform and literally just consuming less resources to get the same workloads done. But this is at the developer level saying, optimizing code. You're saving nanoseconds, which seems insane, like that would matter until you think about millions running simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if someone's got like a tiny little command line tool where they add poly in just to do a few retries, like they're not going to notice this kind of thing. But when you've got but when you've got like a multi-tenant application used by thousands of people at the same time, it all starts to add up.
So start to add up, and again, they're looking at this large statistical model and saying, okay, well, this is showing up in the graph now as a meaningful level of consumption.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
Hey, guys, hold that thought while we pause for these very important messages. And we're back. You're listening to .NET Rocks. I'm Carl Franklin. That's my friend Richard Campbell.
Hey.
And that's Joel Hulen and Martin Costello. And we're talking about Poly version 8, which dropped, a month or two ago?
Yeah, end of September.
And just sort of talking about the whole open sourciness of it, as Richard said, it's sort of a model project for how to collaborate with a bigger company. I mean, Microsoft was very, very cooperative, mostly, I think, because they were incentivized to, right? I mean, they're running it in Azure and they're running it in Teams and in all these big scale things, sites. So they had a reason to do that. Mm-hmm. Other projects may not be so lucky as to have a big corporate sponsor that has a vested interest in their project.
Yeah, that's very true. And I would say that was what impressed me a lot. This is not the first time we've collaborated with Microsoft on this. Mm-hmm. You mentioned it that in the past we worked with Glenn Condron, and I remember Ryan Nowak, one of the developers on the team. Yep. Actually, you guys know Ryan. He's worked on the Humanitarian Toolbox and other things. But that was when we brought in the the Microsoft HTTP resiliency extension, right? And which made it a very simple way to take the HTTP client factory and then be able to add any number of, at that time, poly policies for retrying those HTTP calls on the clients that get created from that. And so at that point, even I think they were very conscientious about. I remember specifically one of the things that Glenn said. Hey, we're thinking of two things. One, you guys just got added to the .NET Foundation at that time, and number two, if we use this and then Poly becomes a dependency of this other library that we're building that millions of people are going to use, we know that some open source maintainers are very concerned about a huge uptick in having to resolve issues that the community submits and having to keep up with that. And that frankly scares a lot of people who just, this is a side thing that they don't want to involve too much time in. And so even at that point, they were very conscientious about that. And it's something we discussed. And it ultimately didn't become a big issue. We never really saw a huge uptick in issues. And that library had its own repo anyway, where they could log that. But so I would say this is twice now that I think the experience has been good with Microsoft. I can't speak for other organizations as far as open source projects go like this.
But I would also say you guys are interacting with the .NET dev team who are working GitHub every day. Like that is their normal workspace. And I think they've learned the culture and work in the culture as much as they've also affected the culture.
That's fair.
But it's also good to see, this has been an ongoing conversation for the past few years about, can you have a good experience with this? And you guys are saying, yes, it's been years of good experience.
Indirectly as well. It's like the previous engagement was how I ended up getting involved with Poly, because I was sort of like interested in what was going on with the HTTP client factory stuff. And I think Dylan was as well. And we sort of interacted in the .NET repos through that stuff. And then I think it was through that sort of Dylan became aware of me and being interested in Poly. And then I think sometime later, that was when he approached me. He was like, hey, do you want to help maintain Poly?
Yeah. Do you want to make your life more complicated?
Guys, I know that we made a pledge when we started .NET Rocks not to actually read code on the audio podcast, right? We're not going to read code to you, but give us a sense of what the learning curve is like if we're using Poly v7 or earlier, and now we want to use the high performance stuff.
So one example of how little work it could be is if you're using the HTTP client factory integration, you can swap it out for the new one, and you can possibly even delete code. Because I spent an hour this afternoon taking out the old one, putting in the new one, and my Git diffs were mostly lots of red, not much green.
Nice.
Okay.
And you just have to swap in, like, assuming you want to use all the defaults, you can like swap one extension method with one name for one with another name, and then just change a few call slides.
So we're talking about names, not necessarily like the patterns are still pretty much the same.
Yes, I think the thing that's the biggest change is configuring it. So setting up what the policies are, that's got the biggest change to it. But once you've got your policy, which is now a resilient strategy, then the call site where you actually use them to do something interesting, though the changes you have to do at those sites are minimal.
Okay.
I mean, wasn't this always the claim to fame for Poly, is this idea of I set up a bunch of recovery strategies or policies, and then you just apply them to the things that matter. So you're not writing that boilerplate over and over and over again.
But you might be writing the response differently. Like, what you're going to tell the user happened if something happens and you finally have to fail back. That message might be different. Or the code that you write in the policy is probably going to change because your URL may change. But things like that, yes, the real work is done in the policy and now in the resilience strategy. So it's really good to hear that pattern doesn't really change all that much. But what is it about the configuration that's so different now?
So I would say the biggest change, which Joel alluded to earlier, was we had all these overloads.
Yeah.
I mean, adding another one. And it got to the point where, I don't know about Joel, but anytime anyone opened a PR, I went, I'm just adding another overload. I'd be like, I'm a bit scared to add that. It might break it. So
how many overloads are too many?
So what we tried to do with V8 was like having a configuration object. So you have an object of options, and if there's a new option comes along, we just add a new property to that object.
Sure.
So there's a couple of convenience overloads in some places. So like retries, you can just do 2 or whatever the API is. I don't have the docs in front of me right now. But in most cases, you have an object and you just set whatever it is you need on the object. So the theory is that we can keep extending it without having to make breaking changes now.
Sure.
Which wasn't necessarily the case with V7.
Load the JSON file, phasers on stun, Kirk out.
We come and shoot to kill.
I would say, for some people, they were using some features like the policy wrap. Was very common. And that was sort of like a nesting egg approach where you take a policy and then you nest another one and another one and another one. And then it would apply those policies backwards when you go to execute it. And so if you're using that, then you're already going to be pretty familiar with the resilience pipeline, which that's how we're just setting these strategies now is through that pipeline. And so it gives you still a nice fluent way to be able to add additional strategies, layer them in there. Right. And so there's a lot of similarity as far as that goes. And then we also had the concept of the registry before. And one thing that you could do is you can have a strategy configuration by name and say you're loading that from some sort of, app config or something like that. You can set an option to automatically reload the policy if the configuration changes. Right. So then that way within a live running environment, you could tweak the configuration, apply it in your configuration service or settings, wherever that is. And then it'll reload that policy for it to pick up those changes without having to deploy new code.
Nice.
Yeah, that's something we use at my workplace. But because previously we were using V7, we had to hand code all of the layers to sit on top of Poly for the reloads to actually work. And we'd effectively have to throw away all of the policies whenever the configuration changed and rebuild it all from scratch. So we could change how many retries or something like that. But with Poly V8, most of that's now built into it. So again, adopting it as a first class citizen within one of the services where I did the upgrade, most of it was taking a hatchet to it and throwing code away.
Right. Always fun. I love throwing code away. What does the .NET 8 landscape look like? I mean, Microsoft is still using the HTTP client factory, so I imagine that moves over to .NET 8 without any breaking changes.
Yep. And that's where you want to use that new Microsoft.extensions HTTP.resilience library.
Yeah.
Right? Where the one that we collaborated with years ago was the Microsoft extensions HTTP Poly. And so it's just swap out that old one for this new library that's built on top of Poly. You're still using the HTTP client factory as the best practice for managing the life cycles of those clients.
And again, I think Martin said this, you're not going to get any performance benefit or degradation either way if you just swap it out.
So if you switch to the new resilience package, you will, because the internals that Microsoft have written in the .NET extensions repository where all of these libraries are coded, they're built on top of our new primitives and wrap into the HTTP client, whereas the old package uses the old primitives. So Microsoft have effectively done the work for you to do the migration. So at a high level, you're just going, hey, HTTP client, make it do resilience with Poly.
Okay.
And one package does it one way and one package does it the other way, and the new one is the more performance one.
So, but there isn't any breaking change. You just change the package name and you're off to the races.
So you need to make a few code changes, like new method names, but also the more you have customized things, the more work it will be to migrate. If you've got some really custom stuff going on, you'll have to read the migration guide and take that into effect. Whereas if you're just doing a simple, just add some retries to my services in case weird stuff happens, the changes should be relatively minimal.
Weird stuff never happens.
Yep. And if you're using dependency injection to set all that up, that should hopefully minimize the number of places you have to make changes. I mean,
of course.
I was looking at that because I'm planning on swapping out those two libraries in a big project of mine today. So I expect it to be smooth.
Cool.
Part of the reason why with some of the changes I made today had so many deletes was because the old way of doing it had the infrastructure code for you to go, if I have a poly registry with some registries in it, put it in the HTTP request. But you have to tell the application what to put in the registry. We're not going to do that for you. But the new library has a method. It's called something like add standard resilience or something like that. And it has like your common or garden 90% case sensible defaults built into it. So it automatically does retries. It automatically does circuit breakers. It automatically takes a timeout into account. So if you don't know much about having resilience at all, if you're writing a new application which doesn't have anything in it, with like one extension method added to your HTTP client setup, you get sensible defaults for free.
That's a complete pipeline, stuff you used to have to assemble.
Yeah. So like most of the stuff I deleted today was all my manual curation of retry 1 second, then 2 seconds, then 5 seconds. Now that's all baked in, and I just deleted all that code and went, for my hobby really stuff, great. I'm not bleeding engineering enough to be fine tweaking everything. So I was just like, just do the defaults. It's fine. It'll be better.
What I like about that is that most people don't know what policies to make. Most people don't know, should I do an exponential backup? Nobody's going to say, well, what are you calling? Nobody knows what that doesn't matter. And I love the idea of sensible defaults. Falling into the pit of success and all that.
Yeah. Take the standards that the cloud guys like.
The pit of success thing with V7 I thought that was always tricky was, okay, I want to do circuit breakers and retries and timeouts. Putting them in the right order. Yeah. So you're not like circuit breaking over your retries or the other way around. Like I always have to look at the documentation to get them in the right order. Whereas with the sensible defaults, someone else solved that problem for you. They'll be in the right order.
Is that a sensible defaults property equals true kind of thing? Or is it just on by default?
You don't even have to do that.
You don't even have to do that.
You just set fuck to false.
Okay.
Hey, I noticed in the docs here you have a section on chaos engineering. I'm delighted.
Yes.
Yeah. So that was Semi. Semi was one of our poly contrib projects that came about a few years ago. And that was by Giovanni. And what we're doing, I think in the next version of Poly, 8.2, I believe, we're going to have that fully integrated into the Poly core. So your chaos engineering will be a foundational piece of Poly. You don't have to pull in an external dependency. Now it's going to be developed alongside Poly itself going forward.
So that's the perfect place to put the chaos monkey. It's like, hey, make this fail randomly.
Yeah.
It's great.
I just like the idea of chaos as a policy. I love everything about that. It just makes me happy.
Yes. Chaos is our policy.
This meeting will come to order. I would like to discuss our chaos policy.
It's an old reference, but it reminds me of Get Smart. You have control. Right. There's the good guys and the chaos, the bad guys.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yes.
Did you yes. Chaos?
The old chaos policy trick.
So there's one other thing, another goal that Microsoft had going into this to meet their needs, but I think benefits all of us, is now there's built-in telemetry and metrics that is part of Poly. So this is very important. Say you've got maybe a large microservices sort of project, which means you've got all these deployed services deployed everywhere. Each of them are implementing strategies, hopefully, and you need to be able to make sense of, okay, where am I seeing failures? How often are these failures happening? What are the metrics involved? So then I can try to tweak these settings as Martin does, within his project. And the built-in telemetry and metrics components will help you do that. And there's a whole document on that now too.
Wow.
It's certainly one of the challenges on the operations side to discern the difference between a successful retry and a failed retry. Like if they're just log entries, you see all these failures, but he's like, did it work or not? Like, how do you associate? And then eventually it succeeded in delivering the package and everything was fine. But, just being able to combine that down well and say, okay, well, this with multiple retries was a success.
It's also one of those things like Joel mentions, all the telemetry. It's a thing we had in our applications, custom written to see when our circuit breaker's firing, when our retry's happening, all deleted again.
Yeah, because now there's a set of policy around all of that. And I presume integrates with OpenTelemetry, works with all the Azure bits that monitor and such.
It will, by virtue of it's built on top of the primitives in the framework.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's event source. Maybe not that one. There's a type baked into it. I've forgotten the name of now. That
you've got the logger,
right?
In the logger factory.
Yeah, so I think it uses the logger to create the events. Then there's something hooked into the logger, which then hooks into I think it's the event source. And then because .NET is now instrumented, if you're then using OpenTelemetry, it will indirectly go through into OpenTelemetry without us as the
consume event source.
Yeah, so Poly doesn't directly integrate with OpenTelemetry.
No.
But it does indirectly through what it is integrated into.
Okay. And it's important to know because it means we don't have another place to look. It feeds into their existing instrumentation. Not that I know anything about that. Well, guys, congratulations. This is a great story. An exciting product.
Very much.
It was good to finally get it out after, was it 10 months, roughly?
Wow.
Yeah, something like that. 10 months. It was definitely a haul.
Mm-hmm. Big push.
And there's a bunch of new, as you mentioned, there's a bunch of resources that we're going to go to, but polydocs.org is probably where you should start. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And also give a little shout out to Peter Sala, who's done so many pull requests to make the Poly documentation better. It's like, and I've forgotten the name of who it was now. I'll see if I can quickly look it up. But someone set up the Polydoc site for us. And then we wrote a bit of documentation to fill it in. And then Peter has added more and more and more on top of it. So it's even better.
One obsessed individual.
Yeah, no, it's great. He also added a lot of patterns and anti-patterns within the documentation, which is excellent. And he also updated the Poly Samples project to use all the new V8 goodness as well.
Nice.
I looked at the name. It was Adam Nova built the new docs site template for us.
Oh, yes.
And Martin, you also have a Poly sandbox that you published. What's that all about?
So I mentioned a couple of times we have internal applications using Poly and doing things like metrics and dynamic configuration and things like that. So I took all of the Poly scaffolding out of an internal application and put it into a public application. So we had something that wasn't proprietary that I couldn't share out in the open with the other Martins and Joel. So sort of took the Poly relevant bits out, just put some boring, to-do app type endpoints on top of it. And then went, right, we do this sort of thing with Poly. We want these use cases to work with Poly V8. And that's where things like the configuration reload, we tested that worked properly. And there was also we had another feature where if we knew our system was down for some reason, Poly doing the circuit breaker and the retries can create a lot of noise, like opening the circuits, closing the circuits again and again and again. It's like, we know it's broken. Stop.
Yeah.
So we had functionality where you could just like preemptively just flip the switch and turn it off. It's like it's to start it broken just so it short circuits immediately. And that was a feature that didn't used to be in Poly. And we sort of brought through this using the Sandbox app.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
And some of that, there's a new strategy called hedging. And that sort of replaces the bulkhead strategy or policy that we used to have, right? And so hedging, it can make several requests to the same thing at the same time. You could do it in parallel, you could do it in serial or whatever, and it will take the fastest response. You could also do things like put a rate limiter on. And that's also new. Rate limiter will allow you to say, okay, I want to limit this to 100 calls to this database, per minute. Maybe it's a very small database and it can't handle more than that. And so you don't want to flood it. And so you can add that just as if that's the only thing you do, if you don't have any other strategies and you just want to rate limit stuff, you could add that on, or you could layer on retries and circuit breakers and other things too.
Wow. Yeah. I could also see, I'm calling an external API that has rules around how hard I'm allowed to hammer it. And I don't want to get locked out. So I'll put the rate limit on
and
under the limit.
And within that strategy too, you can also look for, a lot of those services will have a retry after header.
Right.
You can look for something like that, and then you could tell it, okay, time out for this long before trying again.
Right.
So there's a lot of flexibility in there.
Yeah, strategies to take that on. It's awesome.
And the new rate limiting strategy as well is built on top of the new rate limiting functionality that shipped with .NET 7. So it's yet more code we don't have to maintain. We don't have to do the smarts of rate limiting. We just build on top of it.
The .NET team did that and continues to make
it. They did, yeah, because we talked about doing this way before that feature came out. Or, just before it came out. And so there was that whole thing of, hey, we need this, but we could just wait. And this is going to be part of .NET 7. And let's just build on top of that.
Very good. Well, guys, thanks. Congratulations, as Richard said before. And here's to many more years of success with Poly.
Right on. Thank you.
All right. And we'll talk to you next time on .NET Rocks. .NET Rocks is brought to you by Franklin's Net and produced by Plop Studios, a full-service audio, video, and post-production facility located physically in New London, Connecticut, and, of course, in the cloud. Online at pwop.com. Visit our website at dotnetrocks.com for RSS feeds, downloads, mobile apps, comments, and access to the full archives going back to show number 1, recorded in September 2002. And make sure you check out our sponsors. They keep us in business. Now go write some code. See you next time. Got transmitter banned by the FCC. Yes, I'm a toy boy. Life is hard. Pay my taxes.